The UFC has come a long way in the past 2 decades, and a lot of it is thanks to the face of the company, Dana White, regardless of what people think of the UFC president. Anyways, Dana White recently shared the origin story of buying the UFC. If you want to know all about it, stick with us, because we're going to discuss it in this video. Let's get right into it. First things first, Dana White reveals origin story of buying the UFC. In a recent interview, the president of the UFC opened up about the whole process behind how he and the Fightopia brothers purchased the company and changed the UFC to become a worldwide name. It's been over 20 years now, and Dana White has been the face of the Ultimate Fighting Championship throughout these years. And let's be honest, it's true that he's been kind of a controversial figure in the eyes of many people, but at least within the context of the business model, it's also true that he has helped the UFC reach heights that everyone before thought was literally unattainable. Of course, Dana White isn't the only person who had a hand in changing the UFC as a whole. In fact, he probably wouldn't have even gotten to that point if it wasn't for all the support he received from the Fightopia brothers, Frank Fertitta and Lorenzo Fertitta. Not only did the two help build the product up alongside Dana White over 2 decades ago, but in 2016 they were also able to sell the UFC for an insane fee of around $4 billion. And despite that obvious success, Dana has still chosen to carry on as the president of the UFC, even as the promotion keeps on reaching higher and newer heights again and again and again. And now, in a recent interview, Dana White decided to share all the details on how he and the Fertitta brothers brought this company up from zero back in the early 2000s. Next up, how it all happened. In a recent podcast episode with Grant Cardone titled From $2 Million to $10 Billion, Dana White shared all details of this very inspiring story of buying and changing the UFC. Before he bought the UFC, Dana White just owned 3 gyms in Vegas where people could come and do their daily workouts, but where he also trained fighters too. White ended up representing some of the people playing in the UFC, such as Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. Now, at one point, Dana White got into a huge fight over Tito's contract with the UFC's previous owner, Bob Merowitz, and the argument got so heated that Bob finally flipped out and admitted that they actually didn't have any money and that he didn't even know if he could host another event. And that was the moment Dana White knew what he had to do. The Fertitta brothers were in Miami at the time, so Dana immediately called them up and told them that the UFC was in trouble and that buying it would be a really good opportunity for them. And just like that, Lorenzo started talking with Bob about buying the company. Months later, they bought the UFC for $2 million. Coming up, Dana White's UFC success. A lot of people get really shocked when hearing about the low price Dana White managed to buy the UFC for, and that was the exact reaction Grant Cardone had too when he heard it, especially considering just how high the rate of interest is these days. But Dana went on to explain that at that time, in his own words, nobody believed in this thing. And when he said nobody, Dana meant literally just 2 people other than him, Frank Fertitta and Lorenzo Fertitta. And it wouldn't have happened without them either. Dana White himself didn't have the money to buy the UFC at the time. Financially, at least, this was all the Fertitta brothers. After buying the company, the brothers put Dana White up as the president of the UFC and gave him 10% of the upside. Following up, they had to buy back the DVD and video game rights. Now, when Dana White and the Fertitta brothers bought the UFC, they essentially bought just those 3 letters. There was hardly anything else that came with it, and at the time, the trademark wasn't even really that strong. Apart from that, they just owned a whole wooden octagon and about 10 to 12 contacts, and literally nothing else. In fact, they didn't even own the rights. For example, the DVD rights, which ended up being massive later on, as well as the video game rights, and the whole library was owned by a company called Lionsgate. And so the next step in their plan was to go up to them and negotiate. Eventually, after some discussion, and especially considering that it looked like Lionsgate had zero faith in them, the company decided to sell its rights back for another $2 million. And so considering that the heads of the company didn't really have much interest or confidence in the UFC, they ended up buying the digital rights of the UFC for $2 million. Moving on, Dana White learned a lot from the Fertitta brothers. Considering that Dana White was just a person who ran 3 gyms in Las Vegas and represented the occasional UFC fighter or two, it's pretty crazy knowing that he actually managed to buy the UFC for $2 million. It's a huge jump from gym owner to president of the UFC. And so when Grant Cardone asked him how he did it and where he got the business skills from, Dana White revealed that he learned a lot from the Fertittas. What's more, the UFC president even went on to compare his first 10 years at the UFC too college for him. He already knew the fighting part pretty well, but running a huge company like this successfully was definitely something completely different. But the Fertitta brothers didn't know everything about how to run the UFC. In fact, Dana White shared that both he, Frank, and Lorenzo had to learn about the production business. Not one person in the trio had ever put on a fight or done production, and that was how the three learned all about production, through trial and error and experience. Now let's talk about the future. Just a few years back, in March 2019, Dana White signed a 7-year contract extension that confirmed he would stay in his current role all the way until 2026 at least. After that, we can't really tell whether someone will take over after Dana or whether White will keep on going until the wheels fall off. Still, whatever ends up happening, one thing's for sure. Dana's determined to do everything in his power to keep growing the world of mixed martial arts. And say what you want about Mr. White, but the truth is that he really did make a huge difference in the fighting by owning and changing up the UFC. Moving on, UFC world sickened with Dana White's Okay, so after that inspiring story about bringing the UFC up from nothing to a globally recognized name, it's not surprising that Dana White has built up a reputation for being a really successful business magnate. In fact, it almost even seems like he had the Midas touch among entrepreneurs because no matter which venture he decided to give a shot, they always became successful. Unfortunately, it looks like Dana White wants to repeat the success he found in the MMA with a new competition of slap fights? That's right. Apparently, White firmly believes that people all over the world deserve to see a major slap fighting tournament, and so he has a really simple and logical solution: Power Slap League. Now, the first of its kind slap fighting tournament even has a pretty incredible roster. White also took to social media to announce one of the fighters, but fans felt that it was pretty inappropriate and immediately criticized the UFC president in the comments section. At this point, there's just one question: has the Power Slap League failed before it even took off? Let's find out. Up next, Dana White met with some serious concerns over his next project. Looking back, it's pretty likely that the UFC president is regretting this one Instagram video he posted on the official UFC account. Now, in the now infamous video, Dana White tried to introduce his very first batch of what he called Power Slap Strikers in Ryan Phillips. The Nevada business person had actually been full-on planning on making several more of these videos in a series he called Power Slap Road to the Title, but the response that he got from fans was definitely not what he had been expecting. Dana White's whole plan was to introduce a few slap fighters to the UFC audience, but the thing is, he first needs the support of these local UFC fans if he wants to kickstart his new venture. Unfortunately for the UFC president, it looks like he might have accidentally angered them instead through this odd move. Finally, fans think that the UFC president is wasting his money on Power Slap League. According to the reactions of the fans of the UFC, it looks like this is one of Dana White's business plans that has actually failed miserably. Immediately, fans ripped the post to shreds and questioned White's decision to post it on the UFC handle in the first place, especially considering that it had literally zero connection with it other than having the same owner. If you take a small look through the comments, the most comment reaction you'll find is so many people wondering who thought this was a good idea. Other than that, a lot of other fans made fun of the UFC president for making fun of soccer and then actually having the audacity to put his name on something as weird as the Power Slap League. Another fan voiced concern over Dana doing this, saying, "They got to replace Dana. This is embarrassing." And this is yet another comment that a lot of fans shared their sentiment with. Overall, it looks like the majority of the fans want to kick the 53-year-old out of his position in the UFC. And that's a wrap for this video. What are your thoughts on Dana White's Power Slap League? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.